It is the voice of
Great.
Indiana County, WCCS 101.1 FM and AM 1160. We're talking this morning with David O. Stewart, the author of George Washington, The Political Rise of America's Founding Father. And so good to talk with him, especially at this time of the year in February. Mr. Stewart, good morning.
Good morning. How are you?
Wonderful. Our conversation brought to you by Marcus & Mack, a law firm representing injured people. The George Washington canon is, my goodness, it's extensive and it's varied, and this is a fresh angle. The political rise of George Washington, it was not an easy rise at all for him, and it was not something that he was very enthusiastic about, at least at first, was it?
No, he intended on a military career as a young man and started it. He fought in the French and Indian War and was head of the Virginia regiment that fought on the Virginia frontier out in the forests. And he did it for 4 years, and it didn't go well. He had a blazing start, and then he sort of ended up in the ditch with a number of failures to his on his ledger. And he left the military life, started a new life, and set out to reinvent himself as a political figure. It's a stage in his life. There's 16 years when he really is learning politics at the grassroots level, and people haven't paid much attention to it. They sort of view it as the boring years, and I saw it as the fascinating years when this guy really was remaking himself.
Well, and that's interesting that he had to remake himself. Of course, we here in Western Pennsylvania have George Washington's footsteps all over our land, and from Ligonier all the way through to Katanning and to Pittsburgh. George Washington spent a lot of time in this area, and those were those years where he had to learn some very hard lessons, and it sort of gets us into the concept of George Washington in a way that we don't really think of him as somebody who is very headstrong, someone who's very driven by his ego. It's not the George Washington we know, is it?
He had to learn how to control his bad qualities and accentuate his good qualities. And I think that's part of growing up for a lot of us. And I spent some time out in your part of the country, obviously going to Great Meadows and trying to, unfortunately, Braddock's Field isn't there anymore, but they do have the burial site. And he had nothing but trouble there. I'd venture to say he spent 3 years out in Winchester, Virginia, and fighting in that area, basically never having a good day. The Indians were better at forest fighting than he was, and then his troops were. And, he leaves with his pride intact, but he knows he's not been a success, and he has alienated his superiors, and he needs a new chapter. And that's a fascinating process that many people go through, but we don't think of George Washington going through. We think of him as having an effortless superiority, and it wasn't effortless. It involved a lot of effort.
And you write that chapter for us in George Washington, The Political Rise of America's Founding Father. We think of where he was and where he ended up in American lore, and those years were so key to him. And there were people in his life that sort of provided for him the outlet to become the person that one day he would be.
Absolutely. He had some guidance that was essential. His older half-brother, 14 years older, Lawrence, was a great role model and someone who boosted him up in the world. His neighbor, Colonel William Fairfax, took a very paternal role towards him and sponsored him in many ways. And Washington, by the time he does leave the French and Indian War in 1758, they're all gone. They've died. And so he, at that point, has to figure this stuff out for himself. He's learned some lessons from these other men, but now it's all on him. He finds new mentors. He always keeps his eyes open for that, but he also uses his own really excellent judgment in figuring out how to become a political actor. And it's not an easy thing for him, but he masters it in a way that very few have.
We look at George Washington's career then through your eyes in this book, George Washington, The Political Rise of America's Founding Father, and we watch him take his first tentative steps into the political arena, and then those steps get a little bit more confident each time. Sometimes it's mistakes that lead to lessons learned and fresh steps, but as you were researching this and you were finding out some of the steps and missteps that George Washington took, how deeply did you go into resources that maybe we have not been aware of that were out there?
Well, I spent a lot of time with the records of the Virginia House of Burgesses for the 16 years he served there. Legislator for 5 years longer than he was a soldier, which we don't ever think of him as a legislator. And there's a wonderful episode early in his legislative career when he is a complete screw-up. He's got really simple legislation to stop the running of hogs in this town, Winchester, Virginia, that's in his district. And when hogs run free, they're very destructive. They, frankly, defecate where they want, and they break into people's storage. It's not civilized to have hogs running free. So the people out there wanted a law against this. Well, he presented it to the House of Burgesses and couldn't get it adopted. And finally, somebody else takes it over for him and renames it. It's a wonderful moment in packaging and branding in the 18th century. He renames the bill one to preserve the water resources of Frederick County in Winchester, because, of course, the waste from the hogs would seep into the wells. And as a water quality bill, it sails through the House of Burgesses. And I think that's a great lesson for Washington, which is you have to know how to present the issue. And he learns how to do that.
His temperament, of course, in this period, it changes as well. He's no longer the brash George Washington, but he is evolving into the person that we know as our president. But before he gets to that, he takes that temperament with him back into the military as the general of the American armies in the American Revolution. Talk, if you would, a little bit about that particular development in Washington's life. The George Washington that we knew from prior years certainly was not the man who was the general during the Revolution.
No, he learns as how to control his bad qualities, and one of them that he struggled with his whole life was a terrible temper. And he rarely lost it as a mature figure. He occasionally did still, because it was a very high temper. So as a military leader, he is very collegial. He consults with all of his generals as much as he can. He's very deferential to Congress. This is so much different from how he had been in the French and Indian War, where he would tell his superiors what to think all the time. He would make his case to Congress, but he always made it clear that what they said was going to be the final word, and he understood that. And he's a very different personality. Now, a lot of us get a bit smarter and a bit better controlled as we get older, and so there's some of that going on. But he also knew that he had to control these qualities of his headstrong quality, and he had to learn how to negotiate with people and how to maneuver. As commander-in-chief, he had to deal with not only Congress, but also every governor, every mayor, every local poobah, frankly, that he needed to get some supplies from. And he figured that out. He spent most of his days, not so much on the Army, but dealing with politics. And that, again, was a great education for him, although by this point, he's gotten pretty good at it.
David O. Stewart is our guest. The book is George Washington, The Political Rise of America's Founding Father. It's interesting to me, David, that so many of the people who are offering glowing words and testimonials on behalf of your book are people who've been here on Indiana in the Morning down through the years. And they write so much of how you make this story so readable. And books on some of our colonial leaders aren't always that way. It's a tremendous effort by you to write this in a way that people are going to want to read it. And I know those testimonials from people like John Meacham and Nathaniel Philbrick, they must be very dear to you.
Well, I was greatly flattered and honored by their kind words, but for me, my job is to tell the story, and I'm not telling the story if nobody's listening, and if it's hard to understand. So, what I focus on a lot, and I was a trial lawyer and appellate lawyer for many years. That's what lawyers have to do too, is tell the story, and you have to have the discipline to break it down, make it clear, and understand the people. The people is what's interesting to everybody. That's the part of the story that resonates with us, and we learn from those stories. So that's the part that's fun to me. The writing part is always the most fun to me, and I always hope it comes through.
It's the people, the maturing of George Washington. George Washington, the political rise of America's founding father. David O. Stewart has been our guest. Penguin Random House has the book. You can find it on Amazon and in your favorite bookstore. David, thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you.
Have a wonderful day.
You too. You too.